All right, well, it is, according to my computer, 12 o'clock noon. So we'll say hello to all listeners out there and welcome to our August Hordes Dairyman webinar. My name is Kylene Anderson. I'm an editor for Hordes Dairyman magazine. I'll serve as your host for today's webinar, and we'll focus on corn silage for this year, plus we'll look ahead to 2026. If you're listening to the presentation live, you should have access to the PDF of the slides, and you can print those. In the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. In addition, if you have questions as we go through the presentation, you can type them into the question section of the control panel, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Today, we welcome a familiar face to Hordes Dairyman webinar series, Dr. John Gazer. John has a PhD in dairy nutrition from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a dairy nutrition management consultant with Progressive Dairy Solutions. John also serves as adjunct assistant professor with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, easy for me to say. John, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation titled Making the Most of This Year's Corn Silage.
Thanks, Kylene. It's a pleasure and honor to continue to team up with Hordes Dairyman in your leadership and hopefully bringing some great content to our producers and growers out there and help make effective management decisions as the forage growing season draws to a close. And so we'll have to start the day with some humor at my expense, and we'll start with maybe a couple of different points. One being the adjunct assistant professor appointment with the University of Wisconsin. I think that's otherwise known as a junk professor or junkie professor. So just feel free to call me junk into the future. And then on a different note, and continue with lighthearted. So if you notice at all, maybe a little bit larger forehead visible with me today as my hair continues to fall out. I have the pleasure of raising two wonderful children. We're blessed with healthy 10 and 11-year-old kiddos, but no lie, 30 minutes ago, I was yelling at both of them vociferously. Those of you that know me pretty well, I can get pretty loud. I was voted most spirited in high school as I was fairly raucous cheerleader at games, but I am losing my hair because of my kids, so I'm sure nobody out there can compare and contrast with what I'm going through. But no, they're a blessing. And this year's growing season, now pivoting toward making corn for silage this year, has certainly probably caused some folks to lose their hair, if that indeed is a thing with stress induced hair loss. So let's get into it today. Let's talk about where we at, and we're going to continue to lean on experienced and expert agronomist insights from different regions of the country, and then I'll offer in some of my thoughts as I tend to integrate and interact with a lot of agronomists and support them, but all bringing a nutrition perspective. So we're going to get into some good topics, good discussion. We have widely different growing conditions across the U.S., as you might expect, but the themes that we're talking about this year are quite a bit different than the last couple of years. So it's exciting. We've got some new content that we'll get into, some new insights from Luis Federico at the University of Wisconsin, one of my colleagues in that department. And so we will talk a little bit about high chopping cord toward the back end. And should you have any questions, likely there are lots of questions out there. If my inbox and text message threads and phone logs are any indication, please throw those in on the questions window, and then Kylene and I can get through those. So let's get into it on what we're seeing this year. So I'm going to start out as over the last week, if you get the Hordes Intel newsletter on a bi-weekly basis, if you're not signed up, please do. It's some great content. I'm hopefully bringing some good content to go along with some of our other writers. But this last week or the last couple of weeks, I analogized to we are seemingly in a tie ball game right now, and we're headed into the fourth quarter. So with our corn crop being, we're harvesting corn down south and out west, though a lot of our growers out there in the central and northern United States or later planted corn or our second crop out west, there's still quite a bit of this season yet to play out. So we're pollinating, or we're through pollination, and now we're in the grain filling period. And 2 points with this slide. One, I went to AI and Grok, and I said, hey, draw me a picture of a tie game heading into the fourth quarter. So we are all excited with artificial intelligence and learning from some of our big data sets, but this is also an example of where AI doesn't necessarily give us all that great of insights or all that much of a usable content. So I somewhat put it up there as a joke, as you see a score of, I think, 0-0, but I'm not exactly certain what this Grok AI image, and I tried a couple of times. But coming back to the point, there's a lot yet to play out in our season, and as evidenced by the couple inches of rainfall that our area just experienced the last 12 hours, there are some things that will probably affect our crop cleanliness and quality at the time of harvest that we don't yet have a rock solid grip on. Now, with that said, we've got 3/4 to maybe 4/4 in the books of the season, and maybe we're headed to overtime. Maybe we're just heading to our fourth quarter. So we need to be ready, walk in fields, and be ready to make some late season management decisions, and we're going to cover those today. So like I said, we're heading into the fourth quarter. There's some of the game yet to play out, some of the crop that's yet to play out, but I think at this point, based on what we are hearing across the countryside, yeah, we may be headed to overtime even at this point, and it could go either way. But at this point, I think we've got the ball, meaning that the crop is trending in our direction from a yield and quality standpoint. I'm excited by a lot of what I'm hearing, what we are hearing from agronomists all over the countryside, and ultimately we want to win the harvest. So we're going to go after that, and then we'll offer a couple of points in terms of thinking ahead toward 2026 on what high performing dairies are starting to think about with regard to hybrid selection. But first, let's get into and talk about where we at today, economically speaking, and what kind of financial incentive do we have to optimize this crop. So corn silage is going to continue to contribute $2 to $3 per hundredweight to our bottom line in terms of feed costs. So at the very least, that is a huge component of our feed costs, and we shouldn't need any more economic incentive to seek ways to improve our forage quality, but also our yield, so that we're optimizing what each of our acres gives us in terms of digestible nutrients. As many of you can probably speak to when getting into any webinar or discussion or seminar that I'm leading, I like to reference some economic benchmarks and where are we at and what are the futures projecting. So Mark Linsmeyer and the Margin Smart Group have done a great job in helping us look back retrospectively on where have we been for margins per hundredweight. So that's the left-hand side here. So over the last 12 to 18 months, we've been in a very healthy position financially in the dairy industry. And then as we project out over the next 12 months, based upon Class 3 futures and corn and bean futures, break even, if you follow my cursor, is right here. So we are projected to continue being in a profitable period over the next 12 months, which is excellent. We want to continue focusing on the aspects of our business and especially making high quality feed to find ways that we can improve feed conversion efficiency and add a little bit more margin and profitability to our bottom line. As we think about the factors in forage and feed quality and overall our rations that drive dairy cow responses, whether it be component yield or performance relative to intake and ultimately feed conversion efficiency, which is more tightly related to profitability than is just milk flow and raw milk production. There are many different aspects to our diet and to our feeds, and corn silage specifically, that will influence animal response and efficiency. I tend to focus on carbohydrates, having done a lot of research in this area, both in grad school, but then out in the industry and nutrition, looking at, in the case of corn silage, looking at fiber and starch levels. So we see fiber and starch are two very important components that drive a majority, say 75 to 85% of the energetic value in corn silage. So we will be talking a lot about fiber and starch ratios, but then also about fiber digestibility and starch digestibility. Fiber digestibility is influenced by seed genetics, plant populations, soil fertility, I think agronomic practices and crop protection, just keeping that plant and leafy tissue, green tissue healthy up to harvest, but then also, and to a great degree, Mother Nature and the growing environment. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. Particle size and fragility are also quite important. So particle size in the case of fiber with theoretical chop length, for example, or grain particle size as represented by kernel processing score. Those are important, but we can make decisions that will influence those. So the factors that we're going to talk about today are not necessarily influenced influencing particle size. Rather, these are a management decision that we're going to make at harvest time and relative to our total diet composition, how much corn silage we have in the diet, and what kind of needs we have. So these are going to be more farm specific. But today we're going to focus on carbohydrates, both content and digestibility. And as I talk about fiber and starch, another way to think about these two nutritionist terms are grain to stover ratio. So anytime we talk about the stover or the leafy portion of the plant, that's going to be your fiber, and then the starch, as we know, is coming from the grain. And so the more grain we have, the less fiber we're going to have. These are tightly inversely or negatively correlated. As I mentioned before, the carbohydrates drive a majority of energetic value. And so this was one of our Hoard's Dairyman articles back in 2020. So if you have an archive and you can go back and look for January issue in 2020, where we got into this in some detail. But this is a pie chart just representing where the total digestible nutrients and calories come from in corn silage. And so we can see the yellow and sort of the red or yellow, red or orange easily represent 75 to 80% of the energetic value of corn silage. And that, again, just reiterating the importance of fiber digestibility, starch, and starch digestibility. So the yellow would be the total digestible fiber, and then the red would be total digestible starch. One additional point to take home, as nutritionists, we tend to talk quite a bit about fiber digestibility in our corn silage, and it's certainly an important attribute of our corn silage because it relates both to energetic value like we see here, but it also relates to intake potential. So brown midrib corn silage, for example, with much lower lignin content, it trends with higher intakes, or it tends to relate to greater intake potential in dairy cows. So that's certainly an important attribute of corn silage. However, I also want to point out that in reality, starch and grain drives a majority of the energetic value of the whole silage, and certainly of the carbohydrate fraction. So we need to make sure that we're taking care of the grain and the starchy component of our corn silage in terms of the growing season, but then also harvest, optimizing kernel processing score, and thinking about starch and starch digestibility as much as we do fiber and fiber digestibility. So at this point, let's ask for a little bit of audience engagement, and let's jump into a poll, and perhaps you can offer some quick insights on how did your season start out, say the first couple of months of the growing season, and then this is going to help me craft the remainder of the discussion as we dive into it today. So did your season start out wet, overly wet, where you were delayed a little bit getting into fields? Was it perfect? You got in even earlier than you anticipated in prior years, or was your start to the season dry? So I'd love your input here. If you can help jump in and submit one of these options so that we can get some idea of the start to the season for our listeners out there. All right, so I see our results coming in at about a third of our producers out there have had a perfect start to the season, but actually a majority had a pretty wet start to the season. And this would be right in line with our experience. And as I talk to different producers and different agronomists out there, so roughly 75% of us experienced a wet or perfect start to the season. And so 25% of you out there that were on the dry side, I'm curious what regions you were farming in. Perhaps it was Michigan area, some areas of Michigan, or in the Dakotas perhaps, although the Dakotas have been a little bit wetter as of late. So excellent insights, and we will take that into account now with regard to some recommendations and how we expect the crop to feed. So I'm assuming I have my control, and you're all seeing now the drought monitor as to where we sit today. And largely, we don't have any concerns with drought. And this is unique. We've not been in a position like this in quite some time. I don't have a great memory, nor do I have a great attention to detail, though I don't recall a time period where we've been mid-August heading into the harvest season with corn for silage where it's looked like this, where we've had adequate to above adequate rainfall. So in my mind, these have been some unprecedented conditions for growers. I think if you're paying attention to crop reports, we've seen pretty high expectations in terms of yield and yield potential. So it certainly has. We've had adequate to above adequate moisture right in line with our poll. As we look at the last 60 days, now this is referencing a government website, and I'm showcasing here, if you look at the key on the right-hand side, this is percent of normal precipitation. And so light green to light blue to dark blue represent in excess of 110 up to 200% of normal rainfall. And so we can see, especially down south in Texas and in the Panhandle, we've had far more rain than we've experienced in probably the prior decade or even two. As we look up into the Corn Belt in Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, and even Wisconsin, plenty of moisture. And as I experienced this morning, another couple inches on top of this. As we look at the Southeast, we don't usually have issues with moisture. But let's take a quick look at New York, because this is going to be a talking point with both Michigan and then into New York and the New England area. It's actually been pretty dry. We're in a drought period now where we've been somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 75 or 90%. Even maybe down to 25% of our rainfall. So this is presenting some unique challenges, because if we would rewind back to, say, July 4th and then look back at the prior 60 days, we would have seen the map green to blue to purple even for New York and PA. As we started extremely wet, we had substantially delayed planting. However, the season has flipped around. But by and large, we've had adequate moisture for a lot of our corn acres out across the US. And so how does the crop and how does the plant respond? As I mentioned before, fiber and starch content and fiber digestibility are greatly influenced by the growing environment. And I've long perceived this to be the case, dating back to graduate school in 2008 and then for the first decade out of graduate school. But Joe Lauer in 2022 published some great work that I will continue to reference. I actually met with a couple of plant breeders at the University of Wisconsin asking for some of their updates and insights. We didn't really have a whole lot of new insights, so I'm going to continue to reference this research. And what Joe did was he looked back on, say, 20 to 30 years of hybrid trial work for forage, specifically for corn silage, and he looked at the first half of the growing season impact on resulting quality. And really what I'm going to focus on today is just the amount of rainfall that we've had in the first half of the season, hence the poll question on how did our season start out and what was our crop and conditions like as we got into, say, V4, V5, V6, kind of halfway through that vegetative stage. And what Joe found and observed was for average or dry years, we didn't really have a negative impact on fiber digestibility. Here's NDFT. However, with wet years, we trended down significantly and substantially in fiber digestibility. So I think our common understanding at this point, both anecdotally and then backed by this little bit of research, is that for wetter starts to the season where we have, I would say, above average to excessive rainfall, our fiber digestibility trends down. I don't exactly understand what's happening with the lignification and the development and the gene expression, but let's just assume that if we have a wetter start to the season and our corn grows through wet conditions, we're going to have a bit of a decrease on fiber digestibility. I also want to make some comments with regard to plant pathogens and disease perhaps showing up. So by and large, what I've heard and we'll see from agronomists is that there's some disease noted out there, but really not all that concerned. I think our lack of concern is from a couple of different reasons, which we'll get into, but typically favorable weather coupled with a pathogen that exists, and we certainly don't have any shortage of pathogens or inocua that are out there. So these would be spores and just the potential for disease. We've certainly had favorable weather. We've certainly had plenty of pathogen, I believe, present in the environment. However, as Damon Smith has taught me, a plant pathologist at Wisconsin, we need a susceptible host. And so hybrid disease resistance is a big factor that relates to just susceptibility, but then also crop protection and putting fungicide out in and around where we have silking, white silk, and we've done a much better job, I think, in crop protection practices. So I think this last corner of the triangle has been the one that has been missing, meaning that we don't have huge disease outbreaks right now. However, as we continue to get later into the season and further removed from crop protection and applications, one thing that Damon has told me as recently as last week, even when he was on vacation, was get out, scout fields. We're seeing a little bit more southern rust show up in some areas, which I think I touch on in a couple of the regional discussions, but get out and walk fields. You're going to hear that from me a few times today. So we're going to start out west. We're going to start in California, and then we're going to work our way east. Speaking to a couple of colleagues, a dairy producer, and then one of my colleagues, Tony Timmons, who does work in the Central Valley. We've actually had quite a moderate summer. I was out in California a couple of weeks ago, so it was one of the first times where we hit 105, 106, 107 Fahrenheit for high temps, but it's been a much more moderate summer, lots of days topping out at 80 to maybe 90 degrees. And so I've largely just seen some green chop sample analyses from some of these producers and from Tony. And so up in the northern end of the valley, we're seeing a little bit more variability in starch levels, top to bottom. Not exactly sure why that's the case, if it's grower specific. We've had adequate water available. This is something that Colleen and I were bantering on a little bit before. We've got our full reservoirs, so we haven't had the extreme drought like we've had, say, 10 years ago. But then Central Valley and maybe a little bit further south, per Tony, just seeing the corn had a great summer. We're seeing really good starch levels on the silage, that the first crop coming through, and actually seeing some pretty good fiber digestibility. So by and large, I think we have average to above average crop in California, potential for some great silage. I wonder what kind of impact growers and agronomic practices might be having, but one common theme is that variation, it continues to be out there, and specifically seeing some lower starch levels. So that can drive some inconsistencies within our bigger piles, bigger pits. So just make sure we are on top of that, and don't use moisture as a proxy for nutritional value. We've seen in too many cases where moisture may continue to be at, say, 65%, but nutritional value can swing wildly. So just pay maybe a little bit closer attention to our feed quality within our bigger piles. Moving from California into Idaho, this is a new addition this year, thanks to one of my colleagues, Jason Anderson, putting me in contact with a great agronomist. I carried probably a half-hour conversation with this gentleman who does some great work. So his comment was the crop is trending kind of like a camel with two humps. It's either really good or really bad, which is interesting to me. His comment was, we're not seeing as much average crop for silage this year, which is interesting. He's attributing to hot and dry conditions and the corn perhaps being a little bit further along. We discussed how there are two types of crops, the corn that gets in the ground right away to start the year on open ground, then also later planted corn. And so those two planting periods and those two types of corn are responding differently this year relative to when they've been growing through this hotter and drier weather. We're seeing a little bit heavier pest pressure this year, spider mites. So one thing that we'll want to pay attention to, and again, like I mentioned before, I'm going to continue to reiterate, walking fields, just having an idea and a firsthand feel for the crop characteristics, and if we have pests or disease coming in, what I don't want to see is some insect pressure coming in to the point where all of a sudden our crop is drying out faster than we can get it out of the fields. So this is going to be another recurring theme as we talk about potentially compressed harvest window. Compressed meaning shorter than we'd anticipate. So if we would have, say, for example, 10 to 15 days that we might expect our harvest window to be based upon when we planted and the relative maturity, if we lose even 3 or 4 days of that, all of a sudden we're looking at trying to get 15 days work done in 10 to 12 days, barring any breakdowns, but that puts us in a pretty tight spot. So again, walk fields and perhaps even proactively be talking with our custom cutting crews and having our harvest order corresponding to where that crop is at, not necessarily with where it was planted. We got into some discussion about smoke. And so wildfire smoke is a little bit more of a common theme out in Idaho. They haven't had any of that this year, but for those growing corn in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and Indiana and New York, we've been experiencing some wildfire smoke coming out of Canada. And I've heard anecdotally that hay and haylage are drying down a little bit slower this year, especially when we have thicker smoke cover. And it was just fascinating for me. I was out in New York probably a couple of months ago, flew out of smoke, was able to see it from the sky, and then flew into Detroit. We were under smoky conditions into Detroit, then flew back into Wisconsin. We were under smoky conditions. So this is widespread. And bring this up with your agronomist, maybe carry some discussion in and around how the smoke may be affecting our plants' growth and morphology. Our Idaho agronomist, his comment was chlorophyll, which is the factory that builds out the energy for corn and all of our plants for that matter. In the absence of smoke, it can work really well. We've got that bright sunshine. However, if our light intensity is not as great, there's just not as much energy for chlorophyll to do its job. So it'll be interesting to see and experience what this crop ends up feeding like and what kind of quality we have. So in terms of my nutritionist expectations, if we have a camel with two humps, well, those are all going to end up going into the same pit. So very similar to what I was discussing for our California piles and pits, maybe a bit more variable this year relative to years past. So pay attention to both our moistures and our quality. On average, we're expecting a pretty good crop. So average to plus starch levels, of course, according to our Idaho agronomists. And we really don't have the smoke impact this year, but I think that talking point is one that we can learn from in their experiences out in Idaho. Moving down south, I caught up with Emilio Nino again this year, and he graciously offered his experiences, and this is going to be the start of a several region trend where we're just thrilled with the crop characteristics at this point. Texas has also had a cooler and more moderate summer, similar to California, and with the added rainfall, which is again well beyond what we've been historically, we are seeing some fantastic corn coming about in Texas like we haven't had in the past decade. We're expecting in some areas, even the northeastern panhandle, we may hit 250 to even 300 bushels per acre, which is outstanding. That's just unheard of. Expecting up to 30-ton yields, which is up in Emilio's mind a good 2 to 5 ton per acre. So certainly have the potential for big yields, for us to create some much needed inventory to build out our lacking forage inventories from the past decade. Not seeing much disease this year. Last year we were talking about some pest pressure, but we're not necessarily seeing that this year. And even on our dry land, we're not talking corn necessarily, but we're seeing hay grazer and other forages grow quite well. So it's been a breath of fresh air down in Texas. And so certainly going to be building out inventories. As far as nutritionist expectations, starch levels are going to be up if our grain yields are that high. So expecting increased energy density in our silage. This 2025 corn silage should pack some punch, and in the absence of our pests and disease, we should hopefully have healthier tissue, healthier leafy area, and should have better fiber digestibility than maybe the past couple of years. Moving up the central U.S. and checking in on South Dakota. Again, the crop is looking fantastic. We spoke with Jeff Foles, an agronomist out of the South Dakota area. He gets a little bit, I believe, into North Dakota, working with a lot of dairy forage growers. So the crop's looking fantastic. Got in the ground, and for the most part, well ahead of years past, expecting that the bushels will be there. There were a few environmentally not sensitive, but areas that had been either drowned out or experienced some damage, but by and large, looking pretty good. He's expecting yields to be strong. And here's the start of discussions in around crop protection and fungicide applications. So seeing that we're way up this year, and that was in his mind driven by a wetter start to the year, like we discussed earlier. So I'm expecting pretty good starch levels in South Dakota silage this year, and there's the potential for greater fiber digestibility despite that wetter start to the season if we have much healthier plants and more green tissue and less dead necrotic tissue. Jeff and I did get into discussing planting density, and one thing that we know is plants planted at 35, 37, 40,000 plants per acre, and there's certainly going to be some interactions with genetics, but we can certainly drive yields with increasing planting density, but that will hamper negatively or negatively affect corn solid feeding quality, specifically fiber digestibility. So I've got a reference that I didn't bring in today, but pick up discussions with your agronomist and your nutritionist. If you're kicking around putting out different densities, you might want to do some work checking forage quality and the impact on forage quality in addition to yield. Moving a little bit east into Minnesota. So Minnesota also expecting a great, potentially record crop. Spoke with Luke Daniger, agronomist in southeastern Minnesota, but they cover a pretty wide region, even into western Wisconsin. Luke made the comment that he's pinching himself at times just because of how great this crop is looking. It's even, and it's just been a blessed season to this point. So here's where we're going to start discussing taller statured plants. So we're seeing taller, maybe another foot higher plants this year. And one thing that's come to light in referencing back to my discussions with Natalia De Leon Gotti at University of Wisconsin, plant breeder, the leaves and the leafy tissue have the greatest fiber digestibility, but the midrib and the stover are then considerably lower in fiber digestion potential. And then the cob within the grain is the least digestible component of the plant. So with alfalfa, the leaf to stem ratio largely influences fiber digestibility. The leaves are extremely digestible, but the same can be said to some extent with our corn plants. And so the more leafy tissue we have, the less midrib and the less stover or internode length we have, the greater fiber digestibility. However, if the plants are stretching out, are taller, and we've got a little bit more of that stalk and internode spacing is greater and a little bit more midrib, that can hamper fiber digestibility. So there are a couple of things that we can do in and around harvest to manage that. So for areas like Minnesota where we have taller statured plants, we may have lower quality fiber if we go out into those fields and harvest at our typical cut height of, say, 6 or 8 inches, but we can start to kick around high chopping as a management decision. I do expect that our corn silage in Minnesota is going to be pretty high energy potential as driven by the starch as well, just given what Luke and some of our experienced agronomists are seeing in terms of potential for grain yield. So yet another region where we're expecting pretty high grain yields, which is going to be a great thing from a silage quality standpoint. One thing that came up in discussions with Luke and has been a hot topic as of late, certainly got into maybe just a touch over the last couple of months, but please pay attention in the next 2 issues of Ford's Dairyman in September. We're going to be getting into post-BMR seed corn evaluation, looking at hybrids, talking about what can we do to influence fiber quality in our corn silage in the absence of brown midrib genetics being available by and large. So Luke had that question as well. So it's starting to be, I think, a little bit hotter topic among both agronomists, seed consultants, and dairy producers out there, as we've got a realization that brown midrib seed corn is not going to be as widely available or available at all within the next couple of years. Looking into eastern Wisconsin, I've been working with the Zwald family now the last several months, and Tom Zwald, who's one of the partners with a dairy that I support, he's also an agronomist trained at the great University of Wisconsin. So yet another connection as I put a shameless plug in for my Badgers. Here's another area where we're seeing quite a bit taller corn. So in my discussions with Tom, I said, hey, go out and tell me what we're seeing so that we can then talk about some management considerations as we get closer to harvest. So yeah. Here's another area in western Wisconsin where we're seeing potentially up to a foot taller corn, maybe even a little bit higher than that. Tom made note of some ears even putting on a second ear. So the plants have had so much in resources from a moisture and a heat standpoint that they've started to put some second ears on. Now, in Tom's mind, this is going to be a wild card because these have pollinated, but they're 10 days behind in terms of maturity. And will they really fill out, or what kind of grain yield may we get from these? But even if we get 30 bushels more per acre, that's going to add considerably to our bottom line, I guess, in yield and energy potential. No disease concerns at this point. So just speaking to that added height, there are going to be some potential for tons there. But again, just like I referenced before, and due to the factors that I discussed before, I'm not expecting the quality would be as great on a per ton basis. So here's where we're starting to get into and talk about high chopping corn and moving that cutter head up a fair bit and leave some of that more woody stover portion in the field. Moving a little bit further east into central Wisconsin, another region where planting season is going pretty well. Here's where we start to experience a little bit of unease within this region. Drew, this was a big term for me to wrap my arms around, remembering that I was in the 33rd percentile for my English studies and my standardized testing. So, I appreciate the opportunity to write for Hordes Dairyman and speak in sessions like this, but I'm not overly great in my writing and reading ability. And so as Drew used the term thematic, I had to kind of think about what that meant. And so I think I understand what he means by this, with variability being thematic, meaning that it's by and large widespread through the region that he covered. And Drew's really speaking to, so with getting out and putting on either side dressing nitrogen or doing some crop protection or maybe some trace mineral supplementation, some foliar feeding, we started to, in central Wisconsin and even western Wisconsin, we got more moisture than we needed, but more importantly, it was untimely. So it was tough for us to get our agronomic work done, get our retail work done. Drew's comment that the windows weren't out there for us to get our work done. So that is going to contribute toward variability that we see within our fields. So again, yet another instance where Drew was recommending get out, walk fields, have a firsthand impression of what stage and what the status is of our crops in different fields, and then plan accordingly. We're starting to see a bit of disease show up. We've had pretty humid and quite a bit of heavy dew uh, conditions and experiences. In some cases, Drew commented seeing 16 to 17 hours of dew on plants throughout the day. So uh, Drew didn't have a smoking gun per se. However, he's got a bit of an uneasy feeling with regard to disease potential. So right back to the metaphor of being in a tie ball game with us being at the end of the third quarter to fourth quarter game or four quarter game, or even maybe at overtime. There's still a bit of our season that is yet to play out. So we need to be on top of our crop. One thing that Drew referenced that didn't come up in prior discussions was that actually deoxynivalenol and vomitoxin, and I think it was scab perhaps, was pretty bad through his region in terms of wheat. So historically, that has been a precursor for disease pressure in corn. So just let's be on top of our corn in central Wisconsin, or areas where we've had heavy dew and adequate to above adequate moisture over the last couple of months. And then Drew also commented that we're starting to see some denitrification. So this is something that Kylene and I were talking about, but we're starting to see a few fields that may be running out of gas, so to speak, in terms of just nitrogen being washed out of the root zone with that excessive rainfall, because nitrogen certainly is mobile and just moving out of and away from an area in the root zone where the plants can deal with it. So if our plants run out of gas, that may lead to premature maturation, and maybe our moisture is moving a little bit more quickly. So this could be an area where we could either have a compressed or maybe even an expanded harvest window. But in the event that we have a compressed harvest window, we just want to be on top of it. I'm expecting reasonable quality. I think our grain yields are going to be pretty strong, but this comment and theme of variability warrants a little bit more investment in terms of staging our harvest order, our cut list and fields, and then just staying on top of our crop. And then in the event that we do have a bit of plant disease pressure, or perhaps some potential for mycotoxins to show up in the central Wisconsin area, this preservation and fermentation focus is extremely important. There are bacterial inoculants out there, such as Lactobacillus buchneri, that can keep additional mold or yeast growth at bay and sort of suppressed. And so those certainly warrant consideration as a management practice to just keep the feed as clean as we possibly can through fermentation, and to feed out later this year or into next year. Moving to eastern Wisconsin, I caught up with my buddy Todd Schaumburg yet again, and his comments were, hey, this feels like a bumper crop, but I think we need to maybe temper down our expectations and realize we're just above average, or maybe a little bit better than that, but certainly not necessarily in his mind a bumper crop. It's very uniform in that it was all planted within a week. We had great conditions to start this year throughout the upper Midwest, but we started to see a little bit more spreading out of that homogeneity or consistency with all of the rainfall that we've had. So the relative maturity mattered up until pollination, but in Todd's mind, after pollination, everything comes together. So we perhaps saw some changes with regards to when and how those plants will mature relative to that first half growing season. Todd actually commented he thinks that the earlier and heavy growing degree days or heavy heat units that we've had before pollination might have actually compressed some harvest windows. So Todd's thought was that we may have a tighter or more compressed harvest window relative to what we initially planned on. So again, if you're working with custom harvesters, just pick up the phone, drop them a text and say, hey, where are we at on your list? And let's talk about our approach this year. Perhaps if we realize and working with your agronomist that we have a compressed harvest window, we may opt to start cutting corn instead of say 66, 65% moisture. Maybe we want to go 67 or 68 or at 32, 33 dry matter. Just start chopping our corn a little bit earlier, just with the expectation of it may move pretty quickly as we get in. As far as plant disease, again, another area where we had perhaps double the amount of crop protection fungicide application out there. So that's outstanding, and I think is reducing that host and plant susceptibility and keeping the disease at bay. So no real major concerns from a plant disease standpoint for eastern Wisconsin. And then here's where we start to chime in with a little bit of experience on alfalfa. Todd and I carried a lot of discussions in and around alfalfa impacts for both conventional and Harv Extra. So I won't spend too much time on that today, but this mid-season has been pretty rough for making our perennial hay crops. chiming in with Damon's insights as he was kind enough on his vacation to send me just a couple of thoughts. So we are starting to see some disease come into the Midwest, and I would this is in Wisconsin, but I expect it's more far and wide than that. So southern rust is picking up, which is not something that we've dealt with over the last couple of years. So Damon's comment, and it's going to be the fourth or fifth time I've said it, just get out, work with your agronomist, get out and scout. Make sure we have a firsthand feeling for what's happening within our fields. And in the event that we have southern rust coming in, the potential for a more rapid dry down, building upon what Todd said before, if we had some compression in that theoretical relative maturity and our harvest window shortened up due to earlier season heat, and then you add maybe a touch of disease coming in on that, maybe a little bit further compression of that harvest window. So this is one recurring theme that we heard from Eastern Wisconsin, from Todd, and then also with Damon, just being on top of a potentially compressed harvest window. Moving into Michigan, here's where the script flips just a little bit. We are in a little bit different condition and situation than we were from the Dakotas and Minnesota and Wisconsin. So talking to Dan Bollinger, who's with Pioneer, he's offered some great insights over the last couple of years. And we had some delayed planting due to untimely rains earlier in the year in Michigan. So in Dan's mind, we see Michigan being, and even Ohio and Indiana being closer to New York and Pennsylvania in terms of the season to this point and expectations. So wider planting window, the stronger heat units earlier in the year did compress the range and maturity a little bit, like I mentioned, from Eastern Wisconsin, but it's still pretty wide. So this is, I think, of all the regions that we cover today and are discussing, this is the one that there's the widest amount of kind of unknown yet to play out. And pressing Dan a little bit on just what we're seeing for disease, what our expectations are. He said, hey, talk to me in another week, and we're going to know a whole lot more. So certainly stay close in these regions with your agronomist and ask them what they are seeing both in your fields and other fields. Dan commented we're actually seeing shorter statured corn this year. So while high chopping corn is going to be a discussion point for a lot of growers in the United States, it's not going to be a discussion point for us in Michigan. So we can go out and cut at conventional heights. And if we do indeed have shorter statured corn, but yet end up with pretty good grain yields, I'm expecting pretty great starch potential and maybe even great fiber digestibility to go along with it, that if we've got a greater leaf amount of leaves relative to the stover. So that hopefully is a good thing. Another new addition this year is in the Indiana and Ohio region, caught up with and connected with Greg Newbuehler of G&K Consulting. And so excellent insights, carried around a half-hour call with Greg, and we were very wet in Indiana and Ohio, and this will be a trend as we discuss out into Pennsylvania and New York to start the year. So we got corn in the ground later. However, Greg is thrilled with the crop progress at this point. It's in great shape in his mind. It's a sneaky good crop relative to how the year started, partly because it's just been so hot. I think that's done a couple of things. One, it's helped our corn maybe come on a little bit stronger, but also has helped keep, in Greg's mind, disease at bay. So tar spot and some other plant disease or pathogens out there have maybe even been kept at bay by just excessive or greater heat units, and that's been a good thing. We were shorter on the plant height due to getting in the ground later and some of the heat that came, so expecting decent to good tonnage, but he's seeing outstanding pollination, awesome ears, so we're setting up for some potentially great silage, especially if this shorter stature and shorter nodes increases fiber digestibility. Now, that crop started late and it was pretty wet in the first half of the season, so that may have negatively affected our fiber digestibility, but just given that that crop is shorter and hopefully we end up with more leafy mass in that silage, I'm hopeful that we're going to get better fiber digestibility. Couple that with great grain yields, we could have some excellent yielding silage in terms of energy potential coming out of the Indiana and Ohio area. Then moving out into the Northeast and New England area, in New York in particular. So speaking with Sean Lasher, another one of my colleagues and buddies, but then more so Joe Lawrence with the Cornell Pro Dairy Group. I mean, Joe is an awesome resource. He sent me actually some content that just hit the news wires, I believe, in the last day or so, and I didn't reference it here because I had the slide deck queued up. But check out some of Joe's work and some of the pro dairy content as they're helping producers and growers through this tough season. So it was horrifically wet to start the year. I mean, just excessive rainfall, delayed start to the season. In a lot of cases, we didn't have first crop made until mid to late June. We just couldn't get into fields, and that of course pushed our planting windows way back. And then more recently, like I'd shown in the drought map, it's gotten, or the rainfall map, it's gotten pretty dry over the last couple of months. So our plants started growing through when we eventually got corn planted, plenty of moisture, wet soils where the roots didn't need to go very deep at all. In fact, we're prevented from growing too deeply just from a moisture standpoint, where all of a sudden we dried out. And so we need some deeper roots to go down and find some of that lower subsoil moisture. So we're creating some really tough conditions for our, or we found ourselves in some tough conditions for our crop growing in the New England area. And Joe's comment as of late last week was we're starting to have severe concerns with regard to the plant potential to even make the finish line along Lake Ontario, where we've just run out of moisture. So need some timely rains to keep this crop afloat, so to speak. The widespread to the planting window, or widespread to the planting dates for many growers is going to relate to a wide spread to our corn harvest. So it's going to create some tricky situations, especially where we may have two distinctly different cutting windows or harvest stages, as Joe puts it, to go out and manage. So managing through the harvest this year is going to be a little bit more problematic. We certainly need to be working as a team, both in planning and thinking outside the box for how to make feed this year. We're carrying some discussions around harvesting immature corn silage. Certainly nitrates are going to be a consideration, that just to make sure that we're not harvesting a crop that's rich with nitrates. If we do, let that ferment as long as possible. But then we also will have some hidden opportunities working with local grain farmers where perhaps they're not overly excited about their grain yields and potential. So maybe we can approach them and start to look at some of that grain corn and take that as silage this year. So there are some great resources available from Cornell and University of Wisconsin and others in terms of pricing standing corn for silage that was originally intended for grain. So ultimately, we will get through this. We will be able to cover our forage needs. We're going to need to balance around some substandard haylage, but we'll be able to make it work. Maybe we can't feed the traditional high forage diets as we've long been able to in the Northeast. We'll have to cut forage back considerably, but there are other options, and thankfully other purchased feeds such as soy hulls are not overly expensive right now because the commodity markets have been depressed and pushed down with some lower feed costs. So we're going to certainly need to be creative in creating dairy diets over the next 6 to 12 months in New York, but it's been a tough go to this point. So our thoughts are with you all that have been farming through this. So back to our joke of an AI generated image. We're kind of at the end of this regional insights here, and let's cover our common themes now. So by and large, there's a pretty good crop out there across the U.S. That's what we're hearing from folks. I'm expecting average to above average energy density, with that grain yield being a pretty strong driver of energy density in our silage. Crop protection applications are way up, so we're hopeful and optimistic that is going to help our fiber digestibility. But in the event that we have late season disease coming in and we start to see some dead necrotic tissue showing up and our moistures are dropping pretty quickly, we want to be up on top of that. But so far, so good. We are seeing variability in some areas, as most, I guess, evidenced by the Northeast that we just discussed, but also central Wisconsin and talking to Drew. So just be on top of variation that exists out there, though it seems to be by and large less than years past. We've got areas where we're going to have an expanded harvest window, like we just talked about in the last couple of minutes, but then there are going to be areas like eastern Wisconsin where we may have a compressed harvest window. So we need to manage our crops differently. And again, just encouraging proactive communications with your harvesting. Grain hardness, here's another wait and see. So over the last couple of years, we've had higher starch content in our corn grain and our silage, and the grain has fed pretty good, meaning our starch digestibility in the rumen and dairy cows has been great. However, if we have higher test weights, and this is something to ask both your grain farmer buddies and the local elevator, what are we seeing when we get grain out of the fields this year? If we're seeing 58, 60, 62 test weights, bushel weights, that's an indication that starch digestibility may be a little bit down with harder grain. And then let's get into cut height. And so this is going to be the biggest common theme for 2025 is influencing fiber digestibility and feeding value by chopping our corn higher. So we've got some great insights to lean into from, like I mentioned, here I've got the incorrect reference here, deeper sloot, Shaber, and deeper sloot. It's actually deeper sloot, Shaber, and Federato. So Luis, my apologies if you're listening. At least I've got a screenshot here. So Luis's lab has done some great work in summarizing crop chop height, corn silage crop chop height impacts on grain content, fiber digestibility, UNDF, all the things us nutritionists care about. Ultimately, what we see is if we cut up or go up, say, 8 to 10 to 12 inches higher in cut height, we're going to increase our dry matter, decrease our moisture because we've got a little bit less grain, a little bit less fiber and stover, which we see here with greater starch content. We got a little bit less lignin, a little bit lower undigestible fiber. Our fiber digestibility increases 2 units, but we do, so that's by and large better quality silage, but it comes at the expense of a little bit of a decrease in yield. So here we're seeing about a 0.5 ton per acre hit. What does that all mean for us? I ran through an economic model in which I put a couple of different diets together and a lot of details here, but I'll take you to the bottom line pretty quickly. Going up and increasing your cut height from 8 inches to 16 inches. So we're going to be leaving a little bit more of that lignified, kind of concrete-like stover in the field, and we're going to be increasing our starch content, increasing our fiber digestibility, and that high-cut corn salad. What does it mean to dairy cows? What kind of milk potential? At 22 pounds of dry matter in a high-performing dairy diet, I'm projecting we can gain around 1.5 pounds of milk production. And so what does that mean? With milk being 17 to 20 to 22 cents, we've got potential for, I would say, 20 to 30 cents of added revenue in increased milk production associated with that high-cut silage, though it's not for free because, as I mentioned, there's about a 0.5 ton yield drag. So how does that materialize? It materializes in higher cost silage, because we've got lower yields, and so the cost of production per acre associated with lower yield relates to a little bit more expensive silage. The bottom line, it means 10 cents more in feed costs by way of more expensive silage. But if we can spend 10 cents and get 20 to 30 back, that's a win for me this year because, again, we've got taller statured corn on a lot of acres out there. So this is certainly something that you want to be talking about with your harvesting crew and your agronomist and nutritionist. I like high cutting this year, and thankfully we've got some great research from Luis and their lab where we can pencil this out. And then I would expect we actually do some probably some scenarios as nutritionists and working with producers as well, where we look at high cut and normal. We do some feed testing through the lab and running some our own scenarios. But based on the research, I think this is a slam dunk. As I mentioned, we don't quite know what grain hardness is going to look like this year, but corn silage kernel processing score, we've actually trended back a little bit and down a little bit in the western U.S., which I don't entirely understand, but by and large, the goal continues to be 75 to 80% kernel processing score. So I'm getting a little bit later into the seminar today with Colleen and the Hordes team, but keep our efforts up from a kernel processing score standpoint, and I'm absolutely recommending that we use either the cup or flow test and just watch our kernel processing and make sure we keep it up this year. So as we think about then doing some green chop sampling, remember that one sample is never enough to evaluate any conditions, any hybrid, any agronomic practices, crop protection, whatever we're trialing out on our farm. Make sure we at least take several samples to go along with our yield estimates, and ideally look at then total digestible nutrient yield per acre. I've lost track of how many times I've been asked to take a look at a single feed sample and make an assessment on a hybrid or on some sort of practice that we were implementing to potentially improve corn silage yield and quality. And we can never operate on one single shot, just like we have with sighting in a beautiful vortex optic mounted on a new rifle. We need to make several shots and then make adjustments with that. So with feed sampling, it's much the same. So with that said, we've gotten to the finish line today. Thank you for bearing with us to this point. I hope you've been able to pull some good insights and good content. Again, cutting and chopping corn is a recurring theme, but also we talked about compressed and expanded harvest windows. So as we carry forth with our harvest right around the corner, please be safe. Step up your communications, work with your agronomist, your harvesting crew, and if I can be an additional resource for your dairy or for your crew, by all means, please reach out. I welcome answering questions, helping out. I love the interaction with the Hordes viewers and listeners and readers. You're all awesome. Keep up your great work.
Thank you, John. That was an excellent presentation. And I'll just say if you wanted to view this webinar or any of our previous webinars, you can visit our archives at any time at www.hordes.com/webinars. And as you can see in the chat, we hope you make plans to attend the next webinar, which will take place on Monday, September 8th, again at noon Central Time, where we'll have Jason Lombard of Colorado State University discussing H5N1 in dairy cattle, what we have learned in the last 18 months. And then in October, we will cover milk quality. All right, John, we've had some questions come in.
Excellent.
First one is a little bit more related to alfalfa, but impacts certainly corn silage. What about fifth crop and the latest date we can cut?
So with our harvest windows and intervals changing and maybe shifting around relative to what we would have planned when we put the corn in the ground earlier this year, and then given the fact that many producers that would have gotten a first crop earlier than normal, we're now in a position where we could potentially take a fifth crop. So the old adage of cutting no later than, say, Labor Day weekend or that first week in September, I think we can squeeze another week or two. Now, I may have some agronomists out there that are screaming at me, but I'm okay and comfortable taking alfalfa as late as, say, September 10, 12, even 15, based upon the growing degree days that we've had the last few years. The number of dairies that have continued to not take alfalfa after that first week of September, that's great for the crop health, putting some carbohydrates back into the roots. However, we find ourselves with a lot of regrowth and then needing to deal with and feed through that or harvest that potential regrowth that's just dead tissue laying on the ground after overgoing the winter. So I think we can stretch out another week. And if we need to, and we want to take a fifth crop, we need to prioritize our resources to harvesting corn and corn silage. But I'm okay with stretching out the alfalfa season another week to two to take that fifth crop.
And I know you touched on this a bit, but we had somebody from Pennsylvania. This is more of a comment, but maybe you want to talk about it, saying how dry they have been. They're considering early cutting without measurable rain.
Yeah, that was actually something that my colleague Sean Lasher commented as well, or actually Joe Lawrence spoke to, maybe even both of them, in addition to the viewer from Pennsylvania. So where we've got extreme drought, the point and the spot to pay attention to on the corn plant is the ear leaf. So the leaf on the plant that is directly beneath the ear, that is the leaf that sort of signals if that plant's got a chance of still hanging on and still living. So if that leaf is still green, that plant's got a chance, and let that plant continue to go and just hopes that we get some rainfall to sort of recover and help bring that plant along. But in the event that ear leaf starts to die off, and again, work with your agronomist to determine on whether that plant is dead or not. But if that ear leaf is dying off and we do need to go in and get that corn before that ear development has taken place, try and nail that moisture. I mean, moisture is increasingly important for immature corn. So we certainly don't want to be taking immature corn out of the field at 70%, 72% moisture. That's going to create an absolute nightmare from a fermentation standpoint. We will want to use some sort of a preservative or inoculant. And so good fermentation practices in terms of sealing that silo up, keeping air out, packing it tight. It should pack pretty well, but I would much rather see 68 to 65 moistures on that kind of corn. It may actually be tougher to pack. It just depends. Pay attention to that ear leaf. Pay attention to that ear leaf. It's still green. That plant's got a chance.
Wish I could send some of the rain we're getting right now to them in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, these weather patterns have been just wild.
A question you anticipated getting, John, was is short height corn an option to replace BMR silage corn?
So BMR, just qualifying, brown midrib corn silage is a different beast. That both the mutation and then the breeding program over the last 10 to 15 years with it sits in a class of its own. So there will, and I don't like the comparing and contrasting of different seed genetics with BMR, saying that, hey, this can be as good or better than BMR. Does conventional corn and brown midrib corn silage overlap sometimes in nutritional value and energy density? Sure, but by and large, brown midrib corn is its own beast. So with that said, I'm really intrigued with what I've seen out of a few plots now for short corn in terms of fiber digestibility and starch content and energy yield. So just if we have average grain yields, but our corn is a heck of a lot shorter, that's going to be pretty high starch silage. And then if we've got more leaves and less stover, kind of like I talked through a couple of times in the webinar today, we've got potential for really good silage. So I'm really intrigued. I know Dr. Kaur at the University of Wisconsin is doing some work with short corn, and I expect a lot more insights to come with short corn through some of our commercial plots. So I'm pretty intrigued with it. I think potentially it would be a stand-in for us. It's going to be different from brown bittered corn. I'm not at all going to say it's brown bittered corn, but as we look for that energy-dense silage, short corn is an option, coupled with, I would say, forward-thinking management approaches such as high cutting.
Fantastic. Well, I think we have touched on every question that we had come in, and we are exactly at the 1 hour mark. So thank you for your answers, John, and for a great presentation. And to our listeners, thank you. We appreciate the time you spent with us today, and we hope to see you in the audience at a future webinar, or tune into our Hordes Dairyman podcast, which is available on YouTube or your favorite podcast player. So until next time, thank you from the team here at Hordes Dairyman. Thank you, John.
Thank you all. Be safe.